so much for being here and joining us today. We have Porch Stories at the museum every Wednesday at 2 o'clock, and we'll continue all the way through August, so hopefully you can join us for some more. I'd like to say thank you to our sponsors to Eby's Landing, National Historical Reserve, and to the Friends of Eby, and to Scenic Isle Farm for sponsoring our Porch Story for today. And we're so excited you're here. I'd like to introduce Miss Sarah Schmidt, and we're excited to hear from you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Morgan.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I love your bat shirt.
So, let me know if you can't hear me. Thank you so much for being here. It's always fun to share about one of my dear loves, which is bats. And as I start, I also want to acknowledge the original people of this land who looked after it for thousands upon thousands of years and still are doing so when they can, when we're not in the way. So anyway, I just want to acknowledge that we're on Lower Skagit homeland. And if you don't know, we now have a coffee shop, restaurant on the wharf. Beaver Tails Coffee, which is owned by Tony, who is Lower Skagit, and his wife, and it's really a treat to have them here in Coopville. So, why am I talking to you about bats? Why have I become known as the Bat Lady of Whidbey Island? I'm from New England. I moved to Arizona in 1990 to follow a passion for an interest in studying wildlife. Which I'd been a history major and done other things. And so I was living in southeast Arizona, working for the Forest Service, and my supervisor, who knew I was interested in studying wildlife, maybe going to graduate school to study wildlife, invited me to join him at a workshop, a 3-day workshop on endangered small mammals of southeastern Arizona. And so we saw photos and heard some stories, and then we went out at night, and they put up mist nets, and I will pass around a mist net so that you can see how bats are captured, one way bats are captured. These are also used for birds, and this is just a little tiny piece of it. So this net, which was a 30-foot, it's got big holes in it now, but it was a 30 feet across, and it has several stiff strings from which these soft pockets of this very fine stuff, like a hairnet, hang, and so you can feel that. And what happens is it's so fine that bats can miss that it's there as they're flying through, and they're not expecting it. And if a bat or a bird hits it, they get tangled instantly. And so then you go in with your glove and you gently untangle them, and then you can identify what kind of bat it is, and whether it's a male or female, and take measurements and stuff. Anyway, so at this workshop we went, and and I hadn't had rabies shots by then, which everybody who works with bats has prophylactic rabies vaccinations, because bats can get rabies. It kills them, but it takes a while. And so it's very few bats actually get rabies, but the ones we're likely to come across, like if they're grounded or something, are more likely to be sick bats. And anyhow, so, but I got to look at this little bat in my gloved hand, and it was a Mexican free-tailed bat. It was about this big. I grew up with a mother that loved everything nature. I wasn't afraid of bats like so many people are taught to be. I thought bats were cool. I also thought all bats were like these little brown things like I'd seen in the sky. And I looked at this face, and the Mexican free-tail has this, it looks more like a monkey than a bat. It looks like a cross between a monkey and a puppy. And I just was like, oh my gosh. And then they took her and kept her for a day in a terrarium, and I watched her walk. And this doesn't show it very well, but bats have Bats have bones very much like our bones, but at their hips, they are rotated, their legs are rotated 180 degrees. So that when if we crawled, we'd be bumping our knees all the time. Well, their knees stick up in the air. So I was watching this thing. So they crawl kind of like crabs. And it was just, I was like, this is so fascinating. And I didn't know. And I didn't know that there are 1,400 different species of bats in the world. There are more different kinds of bats than any other group of mammals except for rodents. They are found everywhere except for Antarctica. And on many islands, and so I just became really fascinated. I wanted to share a quote from a book called The Bat in My Pocket by Amanda Lolar, who founded a sanctuary for rescued bats. And the first bat she got to know was a Mexican free-tailed, and she said, "She continued to surprise me with contradictions. She walked like a crab, had the affection of a dog, the intelligence of a monkey, hissed and showed pleasure like a cat, slept like a baby, and unfortunately remembered like an elephant." And have lots of character. And then a month later, after I'd gotten so intrigued by bats, somebody said, I was living in a place called Portal in the Chiricahuas in Arizona, and somebody said, "The bat people are in town." And it turned out that Merlin Tuttle, who was a photographer and also ran a Bat Conservation International, he was there to take photographs for what became this issue of National Geographic.
Wow.
And so I got to go out after work I was running a visitor center, so I got to go out after work every day and hang out with them and learn about bats. And
That photograph, is that the one you were talking about?
uh,
The
talking.
Mexican something?
No, no, that was like the bat in my hand. But these are some photos that show a bat capturing a centipede. It's a southwestern bat. We actually have this species in eastern Washington called the pallid bat. It's here on the left. But I got to watch how he set up and took those photos. So I won't spend more time on that right now, but that's why I'm talking to you about bats, because I got fascinated in them. And a year later, there was a workshop about the people that had come for National Geographic also were exploring the possibility of offering workshops in the Chiricahuas, which they have, I think they still do. They've been doing ever since. And the first year they did it was 1993. And this guy from Everett flew down to take the workshop because he thought it sounded like it would be fun, and that's my husband, Bill. So that's how we met. Bats are kind of important in my life. So, and I definitely want to make sure that there's time at the end for questions. I will try to monitor. If it's getting to be 2:45 or 2:40, can somebody give me a hands up? My husband just did this. Anyway, so there are so many. Bats are really unique. They have many, many fascinating, unique adaptations, and I imagine here there's a whole lot of different levels of knowledge about bats among you. So if you already know things that I'm saying, my apologies. But I want to go over some of the basic things about bats, and then I will talk about our bats. And so one of the things is that they come in this huge variety. And most bats, I'm going to again be passing some pictures around because I don't have a way to, well, I think if I show a picture like this, you won't see it well enough. So many of our bats, about 70% of the bats, eat insects. Sure. Yes, thank you. insects and other invertebrates, including all the bats in Washington. And so the first picture is of one of our bats. We have 9 species on Whidbey. One of our bat species is that one, I think it's Evotus. Anyway, and showing it with a moth. So most of our bats eat insects. The really small ones eat really small insects, and as they get bigger, they eat larger insects. Our big brown bat eats lots of beetles. They are extremely important in the control of insects that fly at night, and if you think about lights at night and the moths and the various things that fly at night, bats are the major predator of night flying insects. And what is hard to sort of get your head around, to imagine and remember. I can remember where I put my notes, which I can't. So we were talking earlier about a place in Texas called Bracken Cave. It is the largest. It's the largest concentration of mammals on Earth. It's a maternity roost for Mexican free-tailed bats that migrate from Mexico up into the U.S. to have their pups. Each bat has 1 baby. They don't have big litters like mice. And there's an estimated 20 million Mexican free-tailed bats in this cave. And I've had so many notes sitting around here, I've sort of misplaced my little because it doesn't matter. 20 million is the equivalent, they eat the equivalent of many elephants each night in weight of insects. So there are these great migrating swarms of moths that come up from Mexico to make their way up into the breadbasket of the plains and the where corn is raised. They're corn earworm moths. And these Mexican free-tailed bats go up, and they've discovered with radar and wind balloons and stuff that they are eating these by the ton. So that's something about insect-eating bats. Obviously, we have many fewer bats, but they still. Oops. Sorry about this. I just want to find. Where's I got it? Oh, there we go. So they eat a whole variety of the insects. And, oh yeah, I know what I want to say. They catch their food in flight. So they don't eat the larvae when they're crawling in the ground or on the plants. They eat them when they're adults. So each gravid female moth or whatever that they eat means a moth that isn't going to lay eggs. So that's part of where they play such an important role in controlling insects. Other bats feed on nectar, and so the next picture is of a nectar-feeding bat. This one lives in Arizona and New Mexico, and they feed on the nectar of, I'll get it in a second, sorry, of saguaro cactus and agave. And then we also have, and so bats that feed on nectar are important pollinators, just like our bees and hummingbirds that feed on nectar. So they have evolved. In fact, if you look at that photograph, you'll see that the nose is shaped to fit right down into the saguaro flower as a perfect pollinator. And the saguaros open their flowers at night. The fresh nectar, the fresh pollen is revealed at night when the bats are flying. And organ pipe and HO, and anyway, there's a bunch of cacti down into Mexico and stuff that they pollinate. Other of our bats in the world, not in the United States, are fruit eaters. And so I have a picture of a short-tailed fruit bat which lives in, the information on the back does not relate to the information on the front because these are from a book. But anyhow, so it's just the name on the front. But this is eating the fruit of a cecropia maybe? Anyway, they are in the tropics. They eat fruit, they poop the seeds, and they are extremely important seed dispersers. Because bats are flying at night, they have far fewer predator concerns, predator threats, and so they can fly across open areas that birds don't. You know, the daytime birds that are eating seeds are going to stay in safer places. And so in particular where there are blowdowns or, you know, for whatever reason, some forest has opened up the bats. Many of the first trees that grow there are ones that have been essentially planted by bats, pooping the seeds. And this is a Jamaican fruit-eating bat showing some of the larger kinds of seeds that they eat. And there are even a few bat species. Well, I'll go to this one since we're talking fruit. Bill and I had the wonderful good fortune of going to Costa Rica on a couple of birding trips, and we also saw some bats, including some of the most adorable bats in the world, which are these little, they're about the size of a cotton ball. They make tents out of leaves. They eat along the rib, and then this flat leaf goes like this, and it makes a tent for the bats. And they actually are fig-eating bats. And then there are even a few species of frog-eating bats. So I have a picture of that. And most of all of the bats in the New World, and most of the bats in the world, in terms of species numbers, I don't know about population numbers, but are what we call microbats. They use, how do they find their food? Somebody knows it. Echolocation. Yes, echolocation, right. So they use echolocation to find food, and to some degree to navigate, definitely to navigate in dark caves.
I'm sorry, this guy just looks so delighted flying toward that frog.
There's some great pictures in here. However, there is another whole separate group of bats, the megabats, or flying foxes. And I'm going to send around a photo of a flying fox. And they have, you might have noticed on pictures that are coming around that some of the bats have funny things on their noses and interesting shaped faces. Well, flying foxes have big eyes, simple noses. They do not echolocate. They did not evolve echolocation. And so they find their food by sight and smell. And they find their food by Google.
So are they technically a bat though?
Yep,
Okay.
they are bats.
And flying squirrels too?
No.
No.
Thank you for that. So that gets me into the next perfect segue.
Yeah, bats aren't rodents, right?
Bats are not rodents. Bats are their own. They're not even very closely related to rodents. They are their
Like a
own.
dog, isn't it?
Yes, so the flying foxes, they're called flying foxes because they look like foxes or dogs. They just, because they don't have we think that the very varied shapes of ears and noses and faces and things in the echolocating bats has to do with echolocation and different adaptations to sending the sound out and interpreting the sound that comes back. And that's part of what's created this great diversity of bat species, because they've evolved to fit all these different little nighttime niches as they, yeah.
So the funny noses and
Yeah.
faces, Do they help with
Well,
echolocation?
it's hard to ask them, but there's some evidence that, like some of the bats that have funny shaped noses and nose leaves, they make their echolocation calls with their mouth closed. And it goes out through their nose. The bats that we see around here, which are mostly myotis, all the bats we see around here, and you'll see in photos like the next one I'll send around, they echolocate with their mouth open. So what I want to, yeah,
So this fox one,
yes,
with a longer snout and bigger eyes, that one depends on sight and smell? Is that
sight
what
and
you're
smell,
saying? Yeah.
and they do not have echolocation. I mean, they can hear, but to find food,
Right.
they do it by like the color, and they're mostly flower. They eat seeds or flowers. They don't hunt insects.
Are they still out at night, or do they run the day more?
They're mostly out at night or crepuscular, dusk and dawn. And again, there's many different species, and different species would have a different story. But I have never been to Australia, which is one of the places that you can see them. But there'll be trees full of them during the day, hanging out in the trees, and then they like all fly out at night to go. Night is safer. They are avoiding a whole lot of daytime predators if they can do their thing at night. So, to show how bats are different from rodents, and I don't remember the latest research. We used to say they were. Well, I think they still are more closely related to primates than to rodents. Carnivora, yeah. So what you will see, it's difficult without big pictures, but this Halloween bat fairly well shows that a bat's arm has the same bones as your arm. There's a shoulder, an elbow, and a wrist, and then there's a thumb, and these two fingers are fused, and then there's the fourth finger and the pinky. So the scientific name for bat is Chiroptera, for the group of animals, bats, the order of animals, and it means hand wing. So chiro, like chiropractor, ptera, like pterodactyl, wing, so hand wing, because their wing is essentially hand bones that have greatly elongated and then have skin that connect them all and connect them to their ankles. Usually their ankles. Always their ankles? I think so. Sometimes they have tails, sometimes they don't. And it also means, well, let's see. So, there's so much about bats. The muscle, the weight and the muscle of bats is mostly in their shoulders, and, for flying. Because they roost upside down, and they don't, some never walk, some can't walk, others can walk, but none of them, except for maybe in New Zealand, live like by walking on the ground. And there's no flightless bats. Anyway, so their legs can be quite weak. They don't need muscles in their legs. So they save a lot of weight, for flying by having little tiny legs. And so I'm going to send around this picture, which is the little brown bat, so the little brown myotis, one of our most common bats here. You have definitely seen one of these. If you've ever seen, unless you've only seen one bat or something, but they're around, they're across most of the country, or they were before white nose. Anyway, there's some threats to these bats in the parts of the country now, but anyhow, very common. And you can see the way the wing is structured and how tiny their back legs are. They're basically, the back legs are just to form a frame to help, hold and spread the wing, and then they have sharp little claws for hanging upside down. Yeah, Gary.
Is there any,
Well,
Oh, sorry.
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Is there any correlation between the size of the bat and their lifespan?
That's it. So is there any correlation between the size of a bat and their lifespan? That's a really good question. Yes, and maybe not what you'd think. So the longest known lifespan in a bat is in a bat that's closely related to our little brown bat. 41 years or 43 years in the wild. So bats that hibernate and are small seem to be the longest lived. And so the flying foxes and stuff, they're not so long lived. I don't remember their lifespan, but it's nothing like that. And I am gonna. So I will pass these around. So these are taxidermied, not necessarily terribly beautifully, but you can see big brown, little brown, and silver hair, which is a really poor example of the silver hair. But anyhow, these are 3 of our species. And there's a little skull here, so you can see their sharp little teeth for eating insects, chewing on insects.
Question back here.
And oh yeah.
So since we're talking about lifespan, I just was curious when you were saying earlier they have one child
Yes.
at a time. How long is their childbearing? Do they like once a year, many times a year until they're gone, or what?
Right. So in the temperate where we live in North America, once a year.
Okay.
And that's because once a year there's a pulse of insects in the summer when it's warm enough and the insects are reproducing, so there's food. In the winter, in most of North America, there isn't food. Obviously, some places in the south, there still would be some insects, but our bats have to figure out a whole different thing for the winter because there's no food. So make sure, I don't think I want to go there quite yet, but make sure I talk about winter. Yeah.
Okay, when I was in Panama 20 years ago, I was taken to a place and saw a fish eating.
Yes, I don't have a picture of that, but there are bats that evolved very long, like their rear claws, which face out this way because their legs are turned. So instead of the toes going back like that, which is something wrong with this, they go this way, and they have these long claws, and they can detect. You know how fish will sort of be by the water surface and make little tiny ripples, and they will scoop them up, and that's all they eat. They are entirely fish-eating bats. And of course, you know that there are 3 species of bats only that are entirely blood-eating bats. So the vampire bats, which are in Central and South America, evolved to feed on nothing else but blood meals, which involves a whole lot of physiological adaptations to process blood. And they themselves, are no particular threat to the animals. Some of them feed up more on birds, some of them more on mammals. They have specialized teeth that make a quick little incision that the animal doesn't even wake up from sleeping. And they can sense heat, so they find where there's a blood vessel close to the surface, and then they have an anticoagulant in their saliva, and so as long as they're licking, the blood will keep flowing. They'll get a blood meal, which is maybe teaspoon or tablespoon, a blood meal, which is like a teaspoon or a tablespoon, and then as soon as they're done, it stops bleeding because the anticoagulant is done. The danger of vampire bats is that they can spread disease, and especially after European development and the introduction of cattle in tremendous numbers, provided tremendous amount of food resource for vampire bats, and so it's become an issue. And one of the really important educational things that happens in Mexico and South is to help people understand that not all bats are vampire bats. In fact, very, very few are. And all these other species of bats are harmless and extremely beneficial and important in various ways within the, the ecosystems, because there's been a history of like just throwing fire bombs in caves. It's like, well, there's bats in that cave, so let's kill them all. And so there's lots of work to do on that score.
How does a bat catch a moth?
Good question. I can answer it in several different ways. There's different pieces of it. So I will mention this. So it catches a moth, first of all, by perceiving its presence with echolocation. And so you'll see bats going cruising back and forth. And as they are cruising back and forth, they are calling, and we can't hear them because echolocation is above our range of hearing. But they are calling, in fact, they're shouting. But high pitches don't go very far. And well, that's sort of irrelevant. Anyway, so like the big brown bat is calling at the same decibel as a smoke alarm. But it's very high, doesn't go very far, and we can't hear it. However, we have tools to be able to listen in. So this is a bat detector, ultrasonic detector, which if you're interested in, I don't know if you can see what Bill's doing. He's doing this with his fingers. So if I do this with my fingers, you don't hear anything, right? There is ultrasound being made. This is higher sound being made by the skin of our fingers rubbing against it. So,
Cool.
and so when bats, if you have one of these, at the end, if some of you want to stay after, I could find on my phone a recording from a bat detector of what it sounds like to listen into a bat. But basically, they're flying along, depending on the species, it's at different frequencies, but they're flying along going, call. And when they get an echo that they realize is food, they speed up their call as they zero in on it. And we call that a feeding buzz. So they're going, and you can actually hear that little on the bat detector, and you know somebody just caught a bug. So that's part of how they catch the moth. The other piece that people don't realize is that for the most part, and we're talking about our bats, again, 1,400 species of bats, lots of different ways of living, so we're talking really mostly about our bats. They use their wings and their tail membrane as nets. And so they will, and I've got wonderful, there are videos you can find, which I put in my slideshow when I am teaching that way. But they, will scoop up the moth and scoop it into their mouth, or scoop it up with their, with the membrane between their tail and scoop it into their mouth. And so they can, when you see bats flying along and they seem to kind of go, and then they keep going, probably they just ate a bug. And that little was reach down, grab it, eat it, and keep going. They'll tumble sometimes. Now, bats that eat larger insects or things like centipedes, they will take that to a roost. They'll carry it to somewhere where they hang upside down and eat it. And often, like with large moths, they will drop, they will cut the wings off, and so they don't have to eat the wings. They'll cut off the extra legs and things like that before they eat the moth. Extra legs of centipedes. Anyhow, so let's see. So that's how they eat. Maybe I will pass around for you to look at. They're going in to meet with Delta. So this is a list of all of our bat species in Washington. And 9 of these I'm sorry, no, yeah, this is all the species in Washington. No, it isn't. Sorry, I'm just reminding myself. All of the species on the front, we have on Whidbey, as well as 2 of the species on the back. Anyway, if you want to look at it, it's a table that tells you some things about what they eat, how many pups they have, just some, it shows you some of the variety among the different species that we have. You can come up afterwards, and there are photos of all of the bats of the Northwest, so you can see them a little closer. But to give you a sense of our own diversity, I mean, it's, for the most part, our bats are brown, and look fairly similar compared to some of the bizarre things that you can see around the world. But these are our smallest and our largest bat on Whidbey. California myotis is the smallest one. Hi, Sammy.
Wonderful.
And then the hoary bat is our largest bat. And this individual, they're all insect eaters. Hoary bats particularly eat large moths. And you will see that she is very woolly. Oh, there's so much about bats. Where do bats live? So, many bats live in crevices, and that's why you get them in your house, because it's like a crevice in a rock or in a tree. If we mimic that in our houses under the eaves or by the chimney, then bats will say, hey, that's a nice home for me. But we do have bats like the hoary bat that never go into a hole. They live their entire life out in the foliage of the tree. And so they need a lot of fur. They're solitary bats. A hoary bat mom will be on her own. She usually has twins, but she's not with other female hoary bats. They're solitary. Whereas many of our bats that go into crevices and into houses, the females, which sort of includes the California myotis, they're not as, they don't make colonies as big as the little brown myotis or the Yuma myotis, but the reason why a bunch of females will gather together to have their pups is that those pups are born naked and blind, and they can't really keep themselves warm very well, so they warm each other, so they need to find a warm place. And then the babies can huddle together while moms are out feeding at night to make milk, to feed milk to nurse their young. So here's these are the skeleton of the bat wing is from another California myotis, and that's the beautiful
Sarah?
hoary bat.
I just want
Yeah.
to squeeze this question in. You said that the ones in the Midwest eat the corn during the day,
Not the bats. That was the insect.
but the bats eat the moths.
Yes.
Okay, so there's no trees, right? So where do the bats go at night that live there to eat those moths?
That's a good question. Barns. There aren't too many places where people live that there aren't trees. I mean,
Oh,
like people plant trees around their houses and things
that's
like
true,
that.
okay,
I don't
yeah.
think hoary bats live in the Midwest.
No, hoary bats don't live in the Midwest.
No, that was.
But
the one
they
that
they
eat the
need
moths,
crevice. They
yeah.
need some sort of.
I just was thinking now
crevices
there's
and things.
acres and acres and acres.
Well, and that's part of the. That's part of why it's important that all these bats in Texas are catching moths before they get to the Midwest.
Yeah.
And the Mexican free-tailed bat flies extremely fast and far. They can travel 50 miles at least in a night to go out and find these
Okay, yeah.
these moths that they're eating. So what haven't I talked about? Let me talk about winter, I think. Yeah.
Sarah, it is 40 right now.
It's
240.
240, thank you. So, winter. Not too many insects here, or anywhere in the northern tier of the U.S. We actually are pretty mild here compared to eastern Washington and across much of the northern tier of North America, as well as everywhere north. So the bats have two options. They can hibernate or they can migrate. And they do both. I mean, different species do different things. Many of our local bats will hibernate. We don't always know where. The little brown, which is our most common little bat, nobody really knows where most of them are in the winter here in the Northwest, which is pretty fascinating, or up into Canada. I mean, just they disappear from places that we encounter them, and so we don't know where they are spending their winters. We do know from that in other parts of the country where there are, like in the eastern U.S. and southeast and across into Michigan and places, there are big caves that offer the right environment in the winter for hibernating bats. And that means when they hibernate, they lower their body temperature, their heart rate, their breathing rate, their body temperature just above ambient temperature. So it can be in the 40s and 50s. They need to be somewhere above freezing, but they can slow everything way down, which means that whatever fat they put on in the before then will hopefully see them through the winter.
What about this last winter when we had, like 13 degrees here in Coopville? You don't know?
Don't know. Don't know. Yeah. Certainly unusually cold temperatures might provide an extra challenge for them. They might have had to burn up more fuel than they're used to. There is one thing about the bats that have been monitored in the winter here, which is there are two species, the silver-hair bat and the California myotis, that are the ones that I most commonly encounter in the winter. People will find them around their house or something. And they have been studied in Olympia, and they, on warmer winter nights, because it's so temperate here in the Salish Sea, they come out of hibernation and they go out and they drink water and they look for winter flying moths. So they don't need as solid, many months of hibernation as bats where it's colder and snowier all winter. And then there are bats like the hoary bat that migrate. And so I'm going to mention a couple of, I won't say it again. There's so much to know about bats. Bats drink on the wing. So when you want to know how can I improve environment for bats at my house or something, one of the things that our bats need is somewhere where there's calm, open water to get a drink when they come out of their roost at night. So I'm passing around a picture of a Townsend's big-eared bat, which is one of the species that, it's not a common species here, but they do occur on Whidbey. So they drink on the wing. Anyway, so migratory bats, I'm going to talk about two threats that are facing bats, and then I think I'll take questions. I've been taking some questions, but so one of them is wind energy. There are really severe what's the word I'm looking for? Kill rate at some wind farms. Thank you. So bats, migratory bats, which include the hoary bat and red bats, which we don't have in Washington, but they're across much of the country. They're both migratory species. They will follow ridge lines and use the wind, just like birds do. They'll use the wind to help them travel faster and farther when they're migrating. It's the same place where the wind is attractive for a wind farm. And so there's a pretty severe issue with some wind farms, quite a few wind farms, and bats. Hawaii is one place. So Hawaii, the only native mammal in the Hawaiian Islands is the hoary bat, the Hawaiian hoary bat. So somehow they got, across the ocean and established there. And wind energy, what a great place for wind farms on the Hawaiian Islands where it's windy all the time. Bats are dying. And there's been a lot of research in the last 20 years since this was people became aware of it. But anyway, battered by harsh winds is what this says, and that's just to remind me to mention that. So people are working to find ways to alleviate it, what can be done, and there haven't been any quick and easy answers, sound deterrence and various things, but at all the bat research conferences, and I've been to the annual conferences the last couple of years, there's always big, sessions on wind farms and what people are learning in the research. Second big threat to bats is white nose syndrome. How many people have heard of white nose? A few of you. So white nose, 2012, it arrived, white nose syndrome. White nose is a Pseudomyces destructa. It's a fungus that grows on the bat, and it thrives in hibernacula environments, like around 50 degrees and moist. And it suddenly appeared in New York State, whatever the year was, not in the 2000s, sometime after 2010, and it it kills the bats. So it particularly kills them. We've talked about hibernation and how they have to live off their fat. When they have this fungus growing on them, it makes them itchy, and so it wakes them up, and they burn up their fat, and they die, or they go out and look for food and freeze or whatever. So there have been huge die-offs, millions upon millions of bats in the eastern United States, and when you see the maps of white nose, it's like each year it has spread out from where it was first found as bats spread it to each other, and it got pretty much over to the Mississippi River, and then something like 7 years ago or so, it suddenly was in Washington State. So it presumably, either a bat came, or bats came on trucks, or we don't know how it got here. It might have come on people's clothes. One of the dangers is humans going into bat roosts, getting the fungal spores on their clothes. They think that's how it got to the United States. So this fungus is in Europe, and it doesn't kill bats there. It appeared in this country, and it's like smallpox. It's the bats in this country don't have a immunity to it. One of the things that is beginning to happen is some evidence that some bats, just from genetic mutations, do have some immunity, and they're surviving, and so over a long time that gives some hope. Okay, I think, yeah. So, questions? Predators, yes. Owls, in places like in Texas, and snakes will hang at where there's big caves, not here, but there are places where snakes are, raccoons, cats. For here, the biggest concern would be outdoor cats, just like with birds. And that's one reason why when people ask about bat houses, well, this isn't bat houses, but if any of you are interested in how to get bats out of your house, this is a informational thing about bat exclusions that you can look at. But anyway, predators. So you're supposed to put bat houses up 12 feet from the ground. That gives the bats a good swoop zone. Because one of the things about the way bats have evolved and hanging upside down, one advantage of hanging upside down is you can live on the ceilings of things where other things can't get you. You can also be up high and you let go and spread your wings and you're flying. It takes, so they want a drop zone. So a little drop zone to get into flight. So it's good for, and they also kind of swoop in when they're landing, and they flip upside down as they land. Yeah?
So the echolocation process, the ears must play a big role.
They do.
Yet the pictures you were showing, the size of the ears really vary. The Townsend bat, big ears, but some of the bats.
Yes,
little
the
ears.
big ears are not, the bats with big ears, that's not for the echolocation. Though the big ears allow them to find insects by the sounds that the insects are making. So they can actually hear the whirring of an insect's wings or the shuffle of its feet on vegetation. A lot of those bats with really big ears do quite a bit of gleaning. So in addition to catching insects in flight, they will hear insects on the ground or on bushes, depending on the species, and they will catch them that way. And so that's what the big ears seem to be for. You don't need big ears for the echolocation. What you need is some amazing brain, modifications so that basically they're seeing with sound. They can, just like we see with our eye. Bats can see. They have eyes. They're not blind. They see fine, but they don't use the seeing for the hunting, for that the fine stuff. Dava.
So, on July 4th, I had bats flying around my porch that seemed to be in great distress, and they were squeaking loudly. And so I was just wondering, like, the fireworks and the echolocation, like, how might that affect?
It's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. I was with some friends on July 4th and saw some bats flying back and forth, but I don't know. I mean, it can't be good. It can't be good for their ears and stuff. I mean, it's just especially some of those sounds that are so loud. At the same time, I mean, and it would certainly affect their ability to echolocate, I think. But that's a fairly short period of, of not being able to hunt. Bats can put up with a lot of noise. There are a lot of bat roosts under bridges, like the classic Congress Avenue Bridge in Austin, where there's traffic rumbling over it. There's lots of noise there, and that doesn't seem to bother them. So that's all I know about that. Yes?
So, to the question about whether the extreme temperatures we had, if it had been a big problem, wouldn't that have been noticed in the lack of population in the spring?
There's nobody looking.
There's nobody looking, okay.
Birds are so easy compared to bats.
And
With bats, you need a bat detector, you need a light, you need special equipment to take any kind of a census or a survey of bats. With birds, you've got all these birders out there who can see the birds and count them, and so we have much better idea of what's happening with bird populations than bat
and
populations.
how are pesticides hurting bats?
Pesticides are terrible. People have asked me for years when I give talks about bat houses, and putting up a bat house for the bats. And that might be nice, but the best thing we can do for the bats and the birds and the wildlife is to allow insects in our lives again, to foster native plants that feed the insects that they need to eat, and not just create lawn deserts and things that don't produce any food. It's habitat and the availability of food is. I mean, I talk about wind and white nose and everything, but loss of habitat and loss of insects are probably the biggest. I would imagine. Yes.
I was just wondering, you said if you wanted to try and create a good area for bats to come and put out water, how do you mitigate that against mosquitoes coming in?
I'm just trying to think that you can do wigglers in water, and I think the bats could still drink that water. I'm looking at my husband because he has science. He answers these kinds of questions. Don't hide. I mean, one of the things that, like, if it's a small water feature, is they make these little things that sit on the water and create ripples, because mosquitoes can't. They need to be able to breathe at a very smooth surface. then you can have dragonfly nymphs in there eating the mosquito larvae and things like that. But yeah,
Okay.
but that's a good question. And the bats will eat some of the mosquitoes, but not necessarily all of them. Marjorie.
Yeah, Sarah, as long as echolocation is so extremely important for bats, why can't they avoid the wind farms?
I'm gonna. Why can't they use echolocation to avoid the wind farms? What speed are they moving? The blades?
Oh, it's hundreds of miles.
The blades are moving hundreds of miles an hour.
Really?
The blades don't have to hit the bat to kill them. There's an air pressure differential, and it's called bariatric death. They'll just
Their insides will burst. They're moving too fast. They're so different from anything that they ever evolved with in terms of the speed of those giant things. The other thing is there's some evidence that there's something about these places that sometimes draws bats in, and we don't know what that is. But that's, in addition to just the problem of them being there is that in certain instances they seem to attract bats.
It's like people
But
that do
really good questions.
wasps. Like if you swatted a bee or swatted a wasp and you disturb the air, they'll come to you instead of going away.
Yeah. There may be something about the air movements. There may be sounds. We don't know yet. Yes, Jan.
Do they go to hummingbird feeders?
Do bats go to hummingbird feeders? Not here, because all of our bats here are insect eaters. But down in the southwest, in Arizona and New Mexico, the bat that I showed you that was feeding on the cactus flowers, they have discovered hummingbird feeders. And it actually happened about the time that we were living in Arizona. It was in the late 80s, early 90s that they began. Our guess is that hummingbird feeders got a lot more people were getting excited. Population goes up, people are getting excited about hummingbirds, more hummingbird feeders are appearing in the environment, and some bats, what's this? Ooh, that's sugar water, and then it spreads. And when I lived in Portal in the Chiricahuas, I could go out at night at my hummingbird feeder and stand just a few feet away, and the bats would come up and they pause briefly as they do a lap, and then they fall away, and then they come back. And so, and at first people were like, why are our hummingbird feeders empty in the morning? Hummingbirds aren't out at night. So it was this whole puzzle, and really, really kind of fun. What was the other question?
Is there anybody on the island, Cookville, or that is good, that knows how to hang a bat house, like the right direction and the right height, and that actually has the equipment to get up to do it? Do you know of anybody?
I don't know of anybody that installs bat houses. No. You can find all of the advice on how it should be done and where it should be done, but I don't know who actually does it. How are we doing?
We're right at
2 minutes. Any more? Yes.
Spiders, do they eat those at night?
Oh, good question. Do bats eat spiders? I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. I bet some bats somewhere probably do, but but I don't know. Gary.
What's the best way, or the preferred method to prepare a bat?
Taxidermy?
No. If you were to eat it.
They taste like chicken.
Well, thank you for
Flying fox.
thank you for asking the
People eat
question.
flying
He's
fox.
asking, how do you prepare a bat for eating? And we're not in a part of the world that bats were traditionally eaten, but in Asia and especially in Asia, bats are considered a delicacy, and some people here have probably eaten them.
No.
Oh.
You don't know when you're eating.
You might have, right. So these are the flying foxes that are, they're big and they'd have some meat on them, and I don't know how much of it is for the amount and quality of the meat and how much of it is beliefs about what comes with, eating a bat. But it is a significant threat to quite a few bat species, especially where there are islands that, there aren't that many bats. And it's another part of the bat research conferences are, sessions where people are sharing sometimes some really great stories about going into communities and helping to educate people about why it's good to have the bats and get them protecting their bats from people that are coming to commercially hunt the bat. It wasn't really a problem when it was just local people eating some local bats, but when it becomes something that's at restaurants in big cities and things, then it becomes a threat. And I don't know any more than that about how to prepare them. Okay, Sam.
Just a real quick question. So I know that bat guano has been used in research a lot. So does every bat have the same characteristics of guano and the bones and things that you can find on the ground? And is that used for research locally in Washington?
There's so much to know
Bat
about
guano.
bats.
So bat guano. This is a sample of some insectivorous bat guano. Our bats. The guano looks a lot like a mouse or rat poop. It's a little brown thing. However, if you press it, it dissolves into little tiny bits of exoskeleton from insects. Cool. When I was where there are nectar feeding bats, their guano was like yellow splats. We would put out plastic sheets to record that. These days, another of the sessions at the Bat Research Conference is all the cool things people are doing with guano and DNA. So there's a place I think it's in Texas, but there's a lab and people from all over North America send guano samples there and they can identify what species of insects those bats were eating from the DNA in the guano. Which is so cool. When I was studying bats, you had to take apart these little things and look for evidence of bits of ant or it was under a microscope. So it has changed a lot in the 30 years since I first discovered bats. Yes?
So we know the folklore about vampire bats, and you mentioned that you don't know whether some people might eat bats because of this perceived whatever. Do you have a favorite piece of folklore about bats? Is there some cultural thing you've learned that stands out to you?
Well, not real. I mean, I haven't gotten that question before. I haven't really thought about it. I do think it's interesting that in China, there's a symbol of bats in a circle with their way, and bats are good luck. So, there's places where bats are considered really bad luck, and given that they're nocturnal, they're kind of mysterious, they fly, they startle people, it's not too surprising that there have been, some negative associations with them. But, yes?
About 30 years ago, my grandson was growing up in Texas, and bats were scary. And when he came one summer, Stella Luna, the book had just come out. And so we bought the book and the little puppet, and I still have it at my house for my great-grandkids to read.
Yeah.
Stella Luna was a good bat, a fruit bat.
Exactly. Stella Luna was such a wonderful gift to bats because so many kids fell in love with bats because even though Stella Luna was not a bat that lives in North America, but whatever, it was a bat. And just because you mentioned that, this is a book that I just got from the library. My niece let me know about it a couple days ago. It's called Amara and the Bats, and it's a lovely story about a girl who loves bats and sees them all the time, and then they move to a new place and there's no bats at the park. And the park is doesn't have any habitat, and so she organizes people and they create habitat and the bats come to the park. I mean, and it's really beautifully done. If anybody's interested, I can send you recommendations for good children's books about bats. So I should probably officially stop because I'm past my time, and I'm happy to stay and keep talking and answering questions. But thank you so much for coming.